Imagine it's February 1944. Halifax Harbor. You're 19 years old, a deckhand, 3 weeks into your first Atlantic winter. You haven't been warm since Christmas. The ship groans beneath your boots, steel tightening in the cold, ropes stiff as iron rods, your gloves are soaked through, your nose won't stop running, but you can't feel it anyways. The Atlantic is slate black. No horizon, just wind and water and war. They told you a Wren's officer was coming aboard today. You pictured a clipboard, maybe someone who'd stay below deck. Then you see her. She's crouched near the starboard rail, bracing herself against the wind. Heavy navy peacoat, collar turned high, thick wool trousers tucked into salt-stained boots, goggles strapped tight across her face, already rimmed with ice. Strands of dark hair have escaped her cap, frozen stiff against her cheek. She's smaller than you expected, but she moves like she belongs here. Bolted to the side of the hull is a steel access plate. She's got it open. Inside, coils of thick copper cable wrap the interior like the ribs of some mechanical animal. You don't understand any of it. You just know this. Somewhere out there, German magnetic mines sit on the ocean floor. They don't explode when they see a ship. They explode when they feel one. Steel passing overhead changes the magnetic field. Boom. Your ship, this ship, is basically a giant magnet moving through water. Her job is to make it disappear. She leans in close to the open panel, snow gathering on her shoulders, ice forming along the edge of her goggles. She holds a meter in one gloved hand. The needle trembles with the roll of the ship. In the other, a small waterproof notebook, pencil tucked behind her ear. She adjusts the degaussing coils, fine, precise movements, tightening here, loosening there. She doesn't rush, doesn't flinch when the deck lurches, doesn't look up when a wave crashes against the hull and sends spray across her face. You look at her and think, she's younger than most of the officers, 22 maybe? But the men who built this ship don't know what she knows, because she understands the invisible. Magnetic fields, flux, resistance, numbers that decide whether this ship reaches England or the bottom of the Atlantic. You were told this was men's work, convoys, U-boats, North Atlantic crossings, but here she is, not behind a desk, not in an office, kneeling on frozen steel in a Canadian winter, calibrating a warship so it doesn't trigger a mine. You watch her finish the adjustment. She studies the meter again. The needle steadies. She nods once, satisfied. You realize something then. If she gets this wrong, you don't get another chance. Years from now, people will talk about code, algorithms, artificial intelligence. They'll talk about Toronto becoming a tech hub. They won't talk about this moment, about the woman on a freezing deck in Halifax Harbor, learning how to fight forces you can't see. Because before Beatrice Worsley helped program and operate Canada's first computer, she made warships invisible.
This number has call control. To get through, please press 4.
What is call control?
Hello? Hello?
I mean, is this the first time we've ever spoken on the phone?
Probably. I was thinking of that. We spoke when you responded to that first message on Kijiji when I was looking for a host. I'm excited for today's episode.
When you told me about this topic and I started looking into early female computer scientists in Toronto, I mean, I'll be honest, I did not think that we'd be opening the scene on a warship in the Atlantic.
No, that's not where you expect the tech story to start.
Right? I mean, I was picturing a lab, maybe a chalkboard, something very University of Toronto basement energy.
Not Sub-Zero Halifax with magnetic minds.
Exactly. Before she helped pioneer some of the early work on computers in this country, she was on naval ships during the Second World War, calculating how to stop them from triggering German mines.
Which is not the origin story we usually tell about Toronto's tech scene.
Not even close. And I'll admit, before we started digging into this, I had never heard her name.
Neither had I. I'd only learned about it by reading a historical plaque in Tattle Creek Park, which is kind of an oversight on our part.
I mean, I think so, because she may have been one of Canada's earliest female computer scientists, possibly one of the earliest in the entire world. She studied at U of T, she worked on Canada's first computer, she corresponded with Alan Turing, and yet, she's basically absent from the popular story of the city.
Which is pretty wild how often people love to talk about Toronto as a tech hub.
Right, exactly. So today, we've got a great guest joining us, Professor Scott Campbell from the University of Waterloo. Back in 2003, Scott wrote one of the first major modern pieces about Beatrice Worsley. In a lot of ways, he helped bring her back into the conversation.
Which feels fitting. She helped build the future, and he helped rebuild her history.
So, let's get into it. Today we're talking about Beatrice Worsley, and we've got Scott Campbell to help us tell that story. I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
And this is Muddy.
Scott, thank you so much for being here. So, for people in our audience that may not know you, can you give a little bit of background about you before we dive into today's topic?
Well, I have I think personally, a bit of a charmed career in that I never really knew what I wanted to do, but I've managed to continuously find my way. My first degree is from the University of Waterloo in computer science from the 1990s, and I did it because I was just kind of curious about computers. And I did a bunch of really interesting co-op jobs. I had a couple of really interesting co-op jobs in Los Angeles, and I learned that I really wanted to do research. I didn't like programming in a cubicle. I had sort of two options. One was I was going to study artificial intelligence, and in the late 90s, maybe I should have. I might have been a lot richer these days if I had studied AI. But instead, I took a few courses from a fellow who said, I think you'd really like to study the history of technology at the University of Toronto. So he wrote me a great reference letter, and I went to U of T. And that's what I did. I studied the history of technology, specifically the history of technology in Canada and the history of computing in Canada, because I kind of wanted to know my own roots. One of the things that computer science doesn't do necessarily very well is look backwards. They're always looking forwards. But I was the type that I was always looking at the back of the textbook, at the little bit of history or the little biographies of various people. And so having never taken a history course, I became a historian and studied the origins of computer science in Canada for my PhD and my master's research at U of T. And it was a fantastic project for me because it combined my love of just trying to understand computers, but also learning how to tell good stories and learning more about something we had kind of come to accept by the end of the 1990s and early 2000s as part of our day-to-day existence, but going back to a time when these sorts of computers just didn't exist. And how did people encounter them for the first time? And how did universities decide what to do with them? And then I was very lucky that by the time I finished my PhD, that same fellow who wrote me the reference letter said, I want you to come back to Waterloo and teach. And that's what I've been doing since.
Very nice.
So we brought you here because you wrote an article about a woman that most people have never heard of. I'll admit in the intro, I explained how I first learned about her from a historical plaque. This is Beatrice Helen Worsley. And for our listeners who were like me, can you give us sort of the 90-second version of who she was and what she did before we dive into greater depth?
The 90-second version. Well, she was
95 seconds is acceptable if absolutely necessary.
Sure. I would say there's two ways to approach this. One of them is to point out that she was Canada's first female computer scientist and possibly maybe the world's first computer scientist, depending on where you want to start counting. But if the listeners are familiar with the movie from about 10 years ago called Hidden Figures, about the human computers who worked for NASA in the 1950s and 60s, she was a similar sort of figure in that she did a lot of work. She was very quiet about it. She was very professional, and she helped really do a lot of things. But then her story was, in a lot of ways, forgotten. Her career ended too early. And so it was a real privilege of mine to sort of rediscover her career and start writing about her back over 20 years ago now.
So why don't we start with her early life and education?
She was born in Mexico. Her family had a textile mill located there. And after some troubles, her family decided to move to Toronto. So she had an older brother named Charles, and they were both very adept students. And he ended up attending Upper Canada College, and she was at Bishop Strawn School. I certainly was not familiar with these before I started studying her. I'm not in that class of society, but it was sort of this fascinating look at how these schools were transforming in the early 20th century. So they were attending in the 1930s. They were both adept at math. She was particularly good at math and physics, was top of her class. When I was digging through some notes and talking to people who are familiar with her records, she was clearly one of the brightest students they ever had in the 1930s. And then immediately went to the University of Toronto to study in the fairly elite math and physics program, where these are some of the
No, I was just going to say, like, how unusual was it in the 1940s for a woman to be excelling in math and physics at places like BSS and U of T?
Rare, not unheard of, certainly. In fact, this was often one of the areas where women could succeed, because I don't want to necessarily use the word meritocracy, because that's a bit of a loaded and problematic word, but certainly it's not hard to demonstrate that you're very good at these skills, but professional advancement could be limited. So certainly getting a degree, doing very well in school was within reach, but opportunities afterward could be limited.
That literally brings me to my next question. At the time, were there any clear paths for somebody like her, or was she kind of just like forging her own path?
A bit of both. There was certainly a bit of a glass ceiling effect, where if we were to look at parallels in, say, there were a lot of human computers at the time. And these were people who were trained at doing computations and using mechanical calculators. And women were thought to be very good at this because they were detail-oriented. They were sort of quiet. They weren't likely to wander off or get distracted. I mean, these are all terrible stereotypes of the time. But there was a lot of women doing these. And if you look at computing centers and services in the 1930s, there you see pictures, it's all women. There might have been, say, a supervisor who'd be a woman, but the director of the lab or the service center would always be a man. So there was a ceiling as to how far they could climb. There were very few, say, female professors in these fields, very few colleagues. I'd have to double check, but my memory was that in the entire class of math and physics that Worsley was part of, there was only one other woman.
She graduated in 1944, which is during wartime, and she decided to enter the service. So what did she do there?
Like her brother, they both decided to enlist. She ended up doing some absolutely fascinating research. So she enlisted in the Royal Naval Service for Women. She does basic training. She requests that she can participate in research. And she ends up on the East Coast in Halifax, where they're doing work on degaussing ships. So degaussing is this process where you're trying to prevent a ship from being detected by a magnetic mine that's been placed. And so it uses essentially the mine goes off when it detects a magnetic signature of a ship. And degaussing is a way of trying to prevent that by limiting the magnetic signature of the ship. And Canada had the responsibility of degaussing all ships heading from the east coast of Canada to Europe. So she's part of the group that's working on this. By the time she gets there, it's mostly routine, but certainly she's part of the group. The war ends. She decides to stay on for another year, and she's doing now actual research at sea, doing corrosion research in the middle of winter. There's pictures of her completely covered in all the possible winter gear, staring down into some sort of display or instrument, covered in snow and ice at sea in Halifax, doing this hull corrosion research, which, as far as I know, she might have been the only Wren to do this kind of research at service at sea.
So, would you say that her wartime experience really influenced the way she later approached computing and overall technical problem solving? It seems like she was learning a lot right there.
I think she was learning a lot about what it's like to be a researcher, to be doing troubleshooting, to be developing your own solutions to problems from the letters and the correspondence that I came across and information from her supervisors, reviews of her performance. They all seemed to think that she was very skilled, very adept at what she was doing. There was no doubt that she was incredibly competent. She was well respected for basically doing what was understood to be a man's job, but she was doing it very well. There was no concern about her gender, let's put it that way, that she was succeeding quite well.
So she decides to go to MIT to continue her work, and there she encounters computers for the first time, but these are not computers in the sense that probably anybody listening to this podcast would understand them. So what did she do there, and what did she encounter? What were computers like in 1946?
In 1946, there's essentially one digital electronic computer that most people know about, and it's ENIAC. And I mean, today that people would know about, they might have heard of ENIAC. They just celebrated a very important anniversary. At the time, it was also one of the only publicly well-known computers. February 1946, I think it was Valentine's Day, there was a big public reveal of this new computer system that was being built down at the University of Pennsylvania on behalf of the US military. And it was a digital computer. If you imagine a picture of a computer the size of a room, covered in blinking lights and vacuum tubes and lots of switches, looking like a giant telephone switchboard, that's what the ENIAC was. Now, there were a lot of mechanical calculators in existence, and some of them were even moderately programmable. If you wanted to get something done in terms of computation, like if you were a scientist or an engineer and you had to just calculate a lot of numbers, you had to sit at a mechanical calculator, or you had to pay someone else to sit at a mechanical calculator and do it for you. One of the most fun things I ever ran across in the archives was professors complaining about having to hire grad students to do all their calculations for the summer. At the time, when Worsley ends up at MIT...
Wait a minute. Are you suggesting there was a time when professors did their own work?
Of course we do. But in this case, it was, well, I have to do it or I have to pay someone else. So I need a grant, and hopefully I'll get that grant or I'm going to be stuck doing it. That was the circumstances. And this leads into something we'll be talking about shortly, about the creation of the computation center at U of T.
Very interesting.
When Worsley gets to MIT, there are about half a dozen projects underway in the United States to build something like the ENIAC. It's an understood problem now. The war is over. A lot of the people who had been committed to building the atomic bomb in the United States, they're now turning to other projects. And so there's a lot of interest in building some kind of an electronic computer that is thousands of times faster than these mechanical ones. And so this is what Worsley is encountering at MIT, is there are projects there where people are trying to figure out how to develop these. There's all sorts of technical issues in terms of what do we make it out of and how do we design it. But people are experimenting with this. But at the same time, as all of these mechanical and electronic calculators and computers are being built, it's against the background of almost 50 years of analog computing. And this is what few people have heard about at all today. Perhaps the thing that people would recognize might be a slide rule. If you have maybe one that your father or your grandfather might have given you as a memento of some sort, a slide rule is an analog computing device. And the simple way of describing how these work is they make measurements that are an analog to the real world. And one of the best ways of describing this is a clock, just an analog clock. in that when the second hand is sweeping, it's calculating time by measuring how long it takes that second hand to sweep from the top of the clock to the bottom. That's 30 seconds. And it's measuring it, it's calculating it by that sweep. And analog computers exist that can do this. They're very complex, very sophisticated. MIT was building the most advanced in the world in the pre-war and the war years. And Worsley is being exposed to these incredibly sophisticated analog computers. And they are the high-tech systems of the day.
So you said it recently, that her dissertation might be the first PhD in computer science anywhere.
So she had a brief sojourn at the National Research Council, but then she winds up at the Computation Center at U of T. And what was she doing there?
She was a staff mathematician, ultimately. She was one of these human computers at the Computation Center. The center is founded to be Canada's first computing center. It's paid for by the National Research Council and the Defence Research Board and the University of Toronto to be a center where engineers, scientists, physicists, they can submit their problems. Instead of hiring grad students, they can submit their problems to this National Computing Center. And they would have the expertise, they would have the staff, they would get all the expensive equipment to do these problems. Turnaround could be months. It's not like today where you have a calculator on your computer or Excel spreadsheets that can do massive calculations instantly. This is months and months of tabulation and calculation. But they have the staff to do it. And they're given all the money to be Canada's National Computing Center. So Worsley is one of the first employees. She's there to use some of these mechanical calculators that they have and start doing some of this work while the other people in the computing center and the leadership team are deciding, well, what computers do we actually want to have here? And it's not really clear in 1947 what that means. If you look at the history of IBM at this period, they're kind of caught. They're dealing with some concerns about being a monopoly, so they're very careful about not breaking any antitrust laws. They're also a little bit upset that Harvard kind of stole some of the glory. IBM engineers built a mechanical calculator for Harvard, and then Howard Aiken said, "This is my machine. I designed it." So IBM's in a bit of a tough place. They're trying to figure out what to do next. They have this long history of tabulator equipment that they can take advantage of, but it's really not obvious what the next step is for anybody. What do businesses need? What do scientists need? These are two different problems. And so on the one hand, you have the scientific computing folk who want just very, very fast calculations. And then IBM, who's built an empire, they're one of the largest companies in the world at this point, building tabulating machines to do payroll for businesses and governments around the world. So what to do in 1947-48 means there are no products to buy. There are no electronic computers, so you have to build one. And so U of T decides, well, we're going to set a small team of physicists and electrical engineers to build a computer. And then we're going to have people like Worsley who are going to handle the calculations and be the service for other physicists and scientists and engineers.
So you think, and obviously this is up for debate, that she may have completed the first computer science dissertation ever done.
So as a historian, I'm not super fond of saying first, because you usually have to add all sorts of adjectives to that, like the first maybe female computer scientist, or the first dissertation about a particular branch of computer science, or something to that effect. But certainly she was there very early, and she was involved with everything we would recognize as an important foundation of computer science, and quite possibly did have that first PhD. It begins when U of T sends her and her colleague, a man named James Stanley, to Cambridge in the United Kingdom, where they are building a digital computer called the EDSAC. And it is based on ideas developed in the United States, but the United Kingdom has a peculiar advantage in that they have no money. In the United Kingdom, they have surplus war material and a lot of gumption, I guess, because they just, well, we're going to do it. And so they build the first digital electronic computers, well ahead of the Americans finishing anything of this class of technology. And Worsley is there. She's there to learn about this system. In 1949, when it's turned on in May, she writes one of the first reports about this system. It ends up being this wonderful footnote in history where Worsley's name is on the description of the first time that the EDSAC is run. And then she proceeds to do her PhD there, studying essentially how to understand computers in a mathematical way. And she's building on the work of people like Alan Turing, and she's studying...
Just for those who don't know, Alan Turing is the Benedict Cumberbatch character from The Imitation Game. He also did
Great
some other
movie.
stuff, but that's really his claim
I
to
think
fame.
he's done some other things too. Marvel or something? I have no idea.
Cumberbatch or Alan Turing?
Alan Turing was a superhero, but not a Marvel superhero. I think. So
Yeah.
yes, she did. She encountered people like Alan Turing during this era. Like, how connected was she to that early kind of circle of computing pioneers?
Very connected. There's correspondence between her and Alan Turing continue for many years. She takes a great deal of interest in his area of research in computing, and they go back and forth. The people at Cambridge that she's working in the lab with, like Maurice Wilkes, like these are leaders in the field. Maurice Wilkes is recognized for decades of research and leadership. She would have met John von Neumann, for instance, who was this American polymath who was sort of one of the leading figures of the Manhattan Project, but then also was a champion of digital computing in the 1940s and 50s. She certainly would have been well connected, and she understood deeply how many of those initial digital electronic computers worked. That was the basis of part of her PhD was, I'm going to explain how these computers work to people who have never seen them, never written programs for them. They don't really understand them. I'm going to explain how they work. How do we optimize them? How do we make them more universal, available to all kinds of users? It was just this, when I stand back and I look at this accomplishment, when she finishes her PhD in 1952, I don't know that anyone in the world would have understood as much about so many different computers and had as experience writing programs for as many different computers at the time as she did.
So now that she was Dr. Worsley, what did she do next?
She comes back to Toronto. They rehire her as a staff mathematician. My impression is that she had gone back and forth a few times and certainly stayed in touch with the people there. But she comes back, and she is there in 1952 when Toronto gets their first digital electronic computer, the first computer in Canada, ultimately. There had been a prototype project that the physicists and electrical engineers have been working on, but it really is only ever that, a prototype. There were stories that this Toronto designed computer that if you combed your hair in the same room, the static electricity would fry the computer and you'd have to reboot it and start over. It was only ever a prototype. So this new computer that comes to Toronto more or less the same time she does is a Ferranti Mark I. And it's designed in Manchester in the United Kingdom based on a computer that Worsley had used while she was in the United Kingdom. And so when it arrives in Toronto, she is one of the only people who knows how to use it. And so very quickly, she is assigned the task of teaching other people how to use it, being the librarian for this computer, in that when people need to use it, she's the one who coaches them through and says, well, you probably need this little bit here and this little bit here, and let me pull this part from the library, or let me give you this instruction manual, or here's how this all works. Because she is one of their resident experts on programming this Ferranti Mark I. And she gets credit for giving the computer its nickname, the Ferret. And Ferret stood for Ferranti at University of Toronto, F-E-R-U-T.
So I was just doing some cursory research, and it said, so this is a computer in the 50s, and it says that, correct me if I'm wrong, it says that it has music generating capabilities. Like, what would that be like in the 1950s?
A lot of these computers had the capability of a few things. One of them was they would have a very basic speaker, and it would literally be on-off kind of thing, like a beep and not beeping. And you could if you remember kind of 8-bit chip tunes from the 1980s on home computers of the day, kind of like that. Nothing so sophisticated.
Right.
But other people figured out that a lot of these early computers were not particularly well shielded in terms of their electromagnetic and radio frequency spill-offs. And so sometimes you could program these machines to emit a radio frequency that would show up on your local radio. If you had an AM radio tuned to the right frequency, your computer could spill out this anomalous radio frequency that could be made to be like music. So there were different possibilities here. Alan Turing participated in one of these sorts of fun projects once.
So through all of this, it shows that she had immense expertise, but in that world, she remained a staff member while others were promoted to professorships. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is most likely gender. There's no way to know why she wasn't promoted. I asked one of her colleagues once, Kelly Gottlieb, who is considered the grandfather of computer science in Canada. And he was her supervisor at Toronto. And he was promoted to assistant and associate and full professor long before she was. He was a few years senior to her. He finished his PhD in the mid 40s rather. And I asked him, so, why do you think she wasn't promoted? And he said, you know what? She was quiet. She was very good at her job. Everyone respected her. And yeah, it probably was her gender. Now, there's other possible reasons. I mean, it's entirely possible she never asked to be a full professor instead of a staff member. I think that's unlikely given the work that she was doing. It's possible that the university decided they were allocated enough of these physics and electrical engineering professors. And until a computer science position opened up, maybe they were waiting for that. I don't know. But gender was almost certainly a limiting factor.
But it finally happened for her in the 1960s, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So from 52 to basically the early 60s, she is a staff member at U of T. She is working in the computing center. So she's helping when people submit problems, other scientists are submitting problems. She is also doing her own research in quantum mechanics, which was a small part of her PhD. And she's publishing lots of papers. She is also teaching some of the first computer science and programming courses in the country with Kelly Gottlieb. She is also recognizing the limitations of programming, and she works with another fellow named John J.N. Patterson Hume. Pat Hume is how he was usually referred to. And they developed something called transcode. It's an early computer language that simplifies the process considerably. Ferret is really hard to program. I have tried to write simple programs for a mental version of how Ferret would have worked, and it's tricky. But transcode simplifies it enormously. Incidentally, Pat Hume was one of the co-founders of CBC's The Nature of Things. He was one of the first people to get that off the ground. Anyway, so she's working enormously in the 1950s. She's doing an awful lot of stuff. By all accounts, yes, she should have been promoted, and she isn't until the early 1960s when the university is finally recognizing that, well, computer science is an actual thing. This is a distinct field. And so you need actual professors of computer science. And she is one of those initial round of professors who they are the ones that belong to this distinct field. She's not a physicist anymore. She's not a mathematician. She is a computer scientist.
How was she regarded by people in her field and in neighboring fields? Did they respect her, or was she just sort of the woman in the office?
No, she was. So everyone told me that she was very quiet, but she was enormously competent, and she was very well respected. And that's clear in the contemporary records, in any sort of a review of her work or descriptions by her supervisors, but also in people that I talked to who knew her. They would all say the same thing, that, well, we didn't really know much about her personality or what she did in her spare time, but she was very good at her job. She was quiet, but she was enormously competent, and everyone respected her. And when I went back and talked to people who knew her, then, oh, right, I remember her. Yeah, no, we all loved her. She was a fantastic teacher. She was a very good programmer. She was just an all-round, very, very competent and skilled expert in this area.
So what was happening in her personal life at this time?
I don't really know. That's part of the problem. Maybe, I don't know if we want to jump ahead to this, but she dies quite young. She dies in 1972. She's 50 years old. And a career that is, in some ways, just finally taking off is cut quite short. And it comes at a time when people studying the history of computing haven't quite gotten their legs under them yet. There are no historians really studying the history of computing. So there aren't a lot of people out there interviewing some of these pioneers like Worsley. There aren't a lot of records. There aren't like big memorial services. There's no real recognition of this early pioneer, and she just kind of disappears in the historical record. Like there's no more publications. People don't talk about her. And so there isn't much to go on to ask about her personal life. She was never married. She has no children. She did some charity work based on the records that she left behind. But in terms of what her personal life was like, there's not a lot to go on.
So you mentioned that she died young in 1972, and one of the great enduring mysteries was she left a bequest for a scholarship in honor of, and I may be mispronouncing this, Helge Lundgren. And nobody knew
Yes.
who Helge Lundgren was, but you think that you may have solved the mystery.
When she dies, she leaves a lot of her files. Most of them are left to Queen's University. So almost everything about her professional career is at Queen's University in their archives. And some of it is in the Smithsonian. There was one historian who was investigating history of computing and asked her for some records before she died. But her estate, everything of value that she owned, it was left to Cambridge University, which is where her PhD was from. And it was a fairly large amount, £75,000, was left to be used as a scholarship for international students studying at Cambridge. And it was in the name of Helge Lundgren. And it really was not obvious why or who this was. But when I was doing this, the research for my initial publication back in 2003, the internet was a little bit more scarce back then, and finding these sorts of details was a little trickier. I asked her one surviving relative, and she said, I don't know. I suspect it was that she knew the answer and didn't want to tell me, and that's fine. So I left it at that as a mystery in the paper. But about 6 or 7 years ago, I was contacted by two separate family members of a Helge Lundgren. He was a maritime engineer. At the time, he was somewhat itinerant. He traveled from place to place. The most likely circumstance is that they met at some point. But I have no confirmation of this. He was possibly connected to the hull corrosion research, maybe, or the degaussing research, or the mystery hasn't been solved, but it's a possible answer of a man who the family described as a bit of a wilder character, perhaps, and that he traveled a lot and he was but they felt, oh, this seems like it's probably the guy. She probably knew him, and maybe there was some friendship or relationship.
Some romance in her life. That'd be
Yeah.
nice. So you
It's
wrote
possible.
about her. Yeah, it's possible. It is possible. I mean, if she put in his name, I mean, that's an interesting mystery to discover. But you wrote about her in 2003.
For any writers
sorry.
who may be listening, I just think it's vitally important to point out that this is a novel right here.
Yes.
Pioneering female computer scientist, and the wild Scandinavian seamen that she loved when she was younger. I'm quite baffled by the fact that this book hasn't been written yet.
This has got like a prime miniseries all over it for sure.
It certainly could be. Hopefully they could do the actual history better than that Benedict Cumberbatch movie.
Yeah. So you wrote about her in 2003, and since then her recognition has grown. Why do you think her story resonates so strongly now?
So, I mean, it kind of helps to get at how I wrote this in the first place. I was doing my PhD on the history of computer science at Toronto. So to help make that happen, my supervisor invited a fellow to give a talk at U of T named John Varglass. And John had just published a book on a similar field, essentially the early development of computer technology in Canada, but more from a defense perspective. And so John gave his talk, and we hung out for the afternoon, and we went out for dinner. And then after dinner, he said, I heard that Trixie Worsley left all of her stuff up at Queen. Somebody should really write an article about her. I'm on other projects. And he just kind of left it at that. And I went, okay, that's a good idea. And then a few months later, a journal in the field on the history of computing announced a special issue on women in computing. And I put two and two together and said, oh, well, I could get to Queen's and dig through those archives and maybe write an article. I didn't know anything about Trixie other than her name just kept popping up in a lot of the stuff I was reading about the history of computer science at U of T. The editor of the journal said, great, I need it in 2 weeks. So I hopped on a train and went to Queen's and went through everything as fast as I could and wrote this article very quickly. I submitted it, and it was accepted in this special issue on women and gender in the history of computing. And then since then, every year I get one or two people writing me just to say, thanks, I knew her, or thanks, this is an inspiring story, or I want to write a book chapter about her, or I want to put her in an exhibit, or we think she should be recognized in some way. Thank you for writing the article. As I started, she was one of these hidden figures that really captures the attention of people, recognizing that a lot of people involved in the development of whether it's science or technology or politics are often not recognized in history. We tend to see the kings and the queens and the generals, and those are the ones that the stories are written about. But the people who are a little bit behind the scenes, their stories are often not told. They're not as important in some way, even though without them, the bigger story doesn't happen. And I think movies like and books like Hidden Figures and sort of a resurgent sense that the development of computing in the 20th century was not driven entirely by people like Alan Turing, but by all of these other people, and that their stories are important. And the fact that women were suddenly recognized in the early 20th century is, oh, wait, there were women doing a lot of this stuff. Worsley isn't alone. There are other women participating in other ways. And it's coming at a time in the early 2000s when I wrote this. The reason the special issue existed was computer science was going through an enormous problem in that sometimes less than 5% of students in computer science programs are women. And they're really struggling with this enormous gender imbalance. And they're trying to figure out what caused this, how do we fix this? And one of the lessons that came out of other people's was that it turned out there were always women, and they were actually pushed out. In a lot of ways, they were pushed out by people who were redefining computing as this masculine thing. That to be a computer programmer was to be this hacker, was to be this sort of bearded late night, chips and chocolate and beer drinking kind of scruffy nerd. And that's what a programmer was. And this happens in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of credit is to people like Nathan Engmenger, who have written about this considerably, or Mar Hicks, who have really shown that women were pushed out and deliberately excluded from this as a profession. And so when I'm writing this article and when people are reading it, they're going, oh, wait, no, women were there. They have to be recognized too. They were skilled, they were respected, they were experts. They were contributing to the field. They were defining the field of computer science and the computer industry. And so having ignored their stories for decades, it's worth recognizing them, but also it helps us try and solve this problem of where did the women go in computer science and how do we bring them back?
And I think that is a huge question that probably the three of us can't cover right now. But I mean, what an interesting topic. And I think learning about people like Trixie is fascinating. It's a great story. And she truly is. And I think that should be kind of like the title for this episode, is one of Toronto's hidden figures, and showing that people like this existed and made an impact in Toronto's history landscape. So Scott, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing this information. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Well, I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo. I would like to plug the fact that we have a computer museum here at the University of Waterloo, and I'm one of the co-founders of that. They can always reach me at my official UW address, or they can visit our computer museum website. And I'm always happy to hear from people who knew Trixie or want to know more about her, or maybe found another little piece of her story. That conversation back in 2003 with John, who said, you know what, somebody should write that story. And I got to it and I wrote it, and it's easily been the most impactful thing I've ever written. Other than my day-to-day teaching, it is the thing I'm most proud of, even though it was this very quick 2-week project.
So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing this information. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Well, I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo. I would like to plug the fact that we have a computer museum here at the University of Waterloo, and I'm one of the co-founders of that. They can always reach me at my official UW address, or they can visit our computer museum website. And I'm always happy to hear from people who knew Trixie or want to know more about her, or maybe found another little piece of her story. And I'm just like grateful of that I had that conversation back in 2003 with John, who said, you know what, somebody should write that story. And I got to it and I wrote it, and it's easily been the most impactful thing I've ever written. Other than my day-to-day teaching, it is the thing I'm most proud of, even though it was this very quick 2-week project.
And guys, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much to Scott Campbell for coming on today. If you want to learn more, feel free to reach out to Scott himself. You could do that. Check out University of Waterloo. If you want to reach out to us, it's buddy_york@outlook.com. And remember, we are on the visual platforms. Come see us on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. You can find us at Muddy York Podcast. There's 2 Y's in the middle there. It's kind of confusing. But yeah, see us, like the video. They're kind of popping off. We love you guys. Keep sharing this great Toronto content. All the best. Stay in the know. This is Muddy York.